10 medieval punishments worse than death. History often remembers medieval Europe through the images of stone castles, armored knights, and magnificent cathedrals rising above crowded towns. Yet behind those impressive monuments stood a legal world that could be astonishingly harsh. Medieval justice was not designed merely to punish crime. Its deeper purpose was to warn, intimidate, and demonstrate power. In many cases, the punishment mattered as much as the offense itself. What makes this subject fascinating is that some of the most feared medieval penalties were not feared because they ended a life. They were feared because they did not. They transformed punishment into a public spectacle, into a lesson that could last for weeks, months, or even a lifetime. Looking back from the modern world, it is difficult not to be struck by how differently medieval societies understood justice. To them, suffering could be educational. Public humiliation could be a legal tool. Fear could be a method of governance, and that is where our story begins. Number 10. The pillory. At first glance, the pillory appears almost harmless compared to many medieval punishments. A wooden framework held the offender's head and hands in place while they stood in a public square. No prison walls, no chains hidden in dark dungeons, just a person exposed to an entire community. But that simplicity was precisely the point. The medieval town was a tightly connected world. Reputation could determine whether someone found work, conducted business, or earned the trust of neighbors. Standing helpless before hundreds of watching eyes could destroy that reputation in a single afternoon. Crowds often gathered long before the punishment began. Merchants paused their work. Children ran through the streets. Curious citizens arrived to witness the event. The condemned individual became a living warning sign placed at the center of public life. What strikes me most is how carefully authorities understood human psychology. They recognized that shame could be as powerful as physical punishment. In some cases, the humiliation followed a person for years after the sentence had officially ended. The wooden frame remained in the square for only a few hours, but its consequences could remain forever. Number 9. The stocks. Closely related to the pillory were the stocks, a punishment widely used throughout medieval Europe. Unlike the pillory, the stocks usually restrained the feet, forcing offenders to sit or lie in uncomfortable positions while exposed to public view. The offense did not always have to be serious. Minor disputes, disorderly behavior, or violations of local regulations could result in a sentence to the stocks. Yet what appears minor on paper often became severe in practice. Weather offered no mercy. Rain, cold winds, or the heat of summer became part of the punishment. More importantly, the crowd once again became an active participant. Medieval justice frequently relied on public involvement, turning ordinary spectators into enforcers of social norms. Reading historical accounts, one detail appears again and again. Authorities wanted punishment to be visible. Justice hidden behind closed doors had little value in their eyes. Justice had to be seen. It had to be remembered. And perhaps most importantly, it had to be feared. As we continue through this list, the punishments become increasingly severe, revealing just how far medieval authorities were willing to go in their pursuit of order. Number 8. The scold's bridle. Among the most unusual punishments of the medieval and early modern world was an iron device known as the scold's bridle. It was most commonly associated with people accused of causing public disturbances through insults, arguments, or behavior considered disruptive by local authorities. What makes this punishment particularly revealing is not the device itself, but what it tells us about medieval society. Order was valued above almost everything else. Communities were small, tightly connected, and deeply concerned with maintaining social harmony. Anything that threatened that balance could attract surprisingly harsh attention. The punishment was often carried out in public. The offender became a visible example of what happened when accepted social expectations were challenged. Once again, humiliation played a central role. Medieval authorities repeatedly demonstrated that controlling behavior was not simply about enforcing laws. It was about enforcing conformity. Looking at these records today, I cannot help noticing how much fear existed beneath the surface of medieval life. Leaders feared disorder, communities feared conflict, and legal systems frequently reflected those fears. Number 7. The ducking stool. For many towns across medieval and later European history, the ducking stool became another method of public correction. The accused individual was secured to a chair attached to a long beam and lowered into a river, pond, or other body of water. The punishment attracted crowds because it combined spectacle with authority. People gathered to watch not only because it was unusual, but because it reinforced a powerful message. Local officials possessed the right to publicly discipline members of the community. Historical records suggest that these events often became major public occasions. Entire neighborhoods might gather near bridges and riverbanks. Children watched, traders paused their business. The punishment became part legal proceeding and part public theater. What fascinates me is how medieval justice repeatedly blurred the line between law and performance. Authorities understood the value of symbolism. The larger the audience, the stronger the warning. Number 6. Branding. Some punishments ended when the sentence expired. Branding did not. In various regions of medieval Europe, convicted offenders could receive permanent marks intended to identify them long after their punishment was complete. The goal was not merely to punish an individual in the present, it was to influence their future. A permanent mark could follow a person from town to town. It could affect employment, reputation, and social standing. In an age where personal identity relied heavily on local knowledge and community trust, such marks carried enormous consequences. This reveals one of the most important differences between medieval and modern concepts of justice. Today, many legal systems emphasize rehabilitation. At least in principle, medieval authorities often focused on visibility. They wanted criminal status to remain visible long after the original offense. And that visibility created a second punishment beyond the official sentence. Every interaction became a reminder of the past. Every attempt to rebuild a reputation faced additional obstacles. Number 5. Exile. At first glance, exile may seem less severe than physical punishment. In reality, many medieval people feared it more than almost anything else. Modern individuals can relocate, communicate across continents, and maintain relationships through technology. Medieval people lived in a completely different reality. Family, work, protection, identity, and survival were closely tied to a specific place and community. To be expelled from that world could be devastating. An exile often lost access to established networks of support. Friends remained behind, family connections weakened, economic opportunities disappeared. In dangerous regions, traveling alone could expose a person to countless risks. This punishment strikes me as one of the most psychologically powerful on the entire list. Medieval society was built on belonging. Exile transformed belonging into absence. The condemned person remained alive, but the life they had known effectively ended. Their home became inaccessible, their community became unreachable, their identity became uncertain, and as severe as exile could be, the punishments ahead reveal even darker aspects of medieval justice. Systems designed not simply to remove offenders from society, but to break them publicly and permanently. Number 4. Imprisonment in medieval dungeons. When people think about medieval punishment, they often imagine dark prison cells beneath castles and fortresses. Surprisingly, long-term imprisonment was not as common as many modern films suggest. Maintaining prisoners required resources, space, and constant supervision. Yet when imprisonment was used, conditions could be extraordinarily harsh. Many medieval detention chambers were never intended for comfort or rehabilitation. Their purpose was simple: confinement. Damp stone walls, limited light, poor sanitation, and isolation turned time itself into a punishment. What strikes me most is the uncertainty prisoners faced. In many cases, individuals had little idea when, or even if, their confinement would end. Days blended into weeks. Weeks became months. The outside world continued without them. For medieval people, whose lives revolved around community, markets, religious gatherings, and family obligations, isolation carried a unique weight. Humans are social creatures. Remove connection long enough, and the punishment begins to affect far more than physical freedom. Historical accounts repeatedly mention the psychological burden of confinement. The absence of news, companionship, and purpose often became as difficult as the imprisonment itself. Number 3. Public penance. Some punishments targeted the body. Public penance targeted the soul and reputation. In medieval Europe, religion shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Religious institutions held enormous influence, and public acts of repentance could become formal punishments for those who violated social or moral expectations. The condemned individual might be required to appear before members of the community, acknowledge wrongdoing, and participate in highly visible acts of repentance. The goal was not merely punishment, it was submission. Modern audiences often underestimate the power of such penalties. In a deeply religious society, public judgment carried immense significance. Reputation extended beyond business and social relationships. It touched questions of morality, honor, and spiritual standing. Reading these records, I am often reminded that medieval justice was not only concerned with controlling behavior, it sought to shape identity. Authorities wanted offenders to demonstrate obedience before witnesses. The punishment became a ritual reaffirming the values of the community itself. And because those values were shared by nearly everyone around them, the pressure could be overwhelming. Number 2. The galleys. For centuries in parts of Europe, one of the most dreaded sentences involved service aboard large rowing vessels known as galleys. While the exact conditions varied by region and period, the punishment became infamous for the relentless labor it demanded. Unlike dramatic public punishments that lasted a day or a week, galley service could consume years of a person's life. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and physically demanding. Day after day followed the same pattern. The horizon changed, but the routine rarely did. Freedom disappeared into an endless cycle of labor and discipline. What fascinates me is how effectively this punishment combined several forms of suffering. It removed liberty, separated individuals from their homes, imposed constant work, and extended the sentence across vast stretches of time. Many medieval punishments relied on spectacle. The galleys relied on endurance, and in some ways, endurance can be more frightening than a moment of pain. The challenge is not surviving a single day. The challenge is surviving thousands of nearly identical days. Which brings us to the final entry on this list. Perhaps the punishment that best captures the medieval obsession with making justice visible, memorable, and impossible to ignore. Number 1. Outlawry. Of all the punishments found in medieval legal traditions, outlawry may be the most misunderstood, and arguably one of the most terrifying. At first glance, the sentence sounds simple. A person was declared outside the protection of the law, but those words carried consequences far beyond what modern audiences usually imagine. Medieval society functioned because people belonged to legal communities. Rights, protection, property, contracts, and personal security all depended on recognition by the authorities and by fellow members of society. To be declared an outlaw was to lose that recognition. The punishment did not always involve a prison, chains, or a public square. Instead, it removed something even more fundamental: legal existence. A person who had been placed outside the law often found it nearly impossible to seek protection, resolve disputes, defend property, or rely on the institutions that governed ordinary life. The sentence transformed an individual into someone standing beyond the boundaries of accepted society. What makes outlawry so remarkable is its psychological power. Many punishments inflicted suffering directly. Outlawry changed the relationship between a person and the entire world around them. Imagine a society where every road, every market, every town, and every authority figure suddenly became uncertain. Not because the landscape had changed, but because your place within it had vanished. For medieval people, that possibility was terrifying. And perhaps that is the central lesson running through all 10 punishments we have explored. The medieval world did not view justice the way most modern societies do. Punishment was rarely hidden. It was designed to be seen. It was meant to educate witnesses, reinforce authority, and demonstrate the consequences of crossing accepted boundaries. The pillory destroyed reputation. The stocks invited public judgment. The scold's bridle and ducking stool turned discipline into spectacle. Branding marked a person long after the sentence ended. Exile severed the bonds of community. Imprisonment isolated. Public penance demanded submission. The galleys consumed years of life, and outlawry erased the protections that made society possible. What strikes me most after studying these punishments is not simply their severity. It is how deeply they reflected the fears of medieval society itself. These communities feared disorder. They feared crime. They feared challenges to authority. Above all, they feared instability in a world that was already difficult, dangerous, and unpredictable. The legal systems they created became mirrors of those anxieties. Yet history offers another lesson as well. Many of these punishments disappeared not because crime vanished, but because ideas changed. Over centuries, societies gradually began asking different questions. Instead of focusing solely on punishment, people increasingly debated fairness, proportionality, legal rights, and the possibility of rehabilitation. That transformation was neither quick nor perfect. In many places, it took hundreds of years, but it fundamentally changed how justice was understood. Looking back today, the medieval punishments on this list remain fascinating not merely because they were severe, but because they reveal an entirely different way of thinking about law, power, and human behavior. The stone castles still stand. The cathedrals still dominate ancient skylines. The town squares still attract visitors from around the world. Yet the punishments that once filled those spaces with fear have largely faded into history. And perhaps that is why they continue to captivate us. They remind us that the past was not simply a different time. In many ways, it was a different world.